brands today have to think a lot more about a lot more than just the bottom line and stock price and things like that. More and more, I think, because customers are really demanding it, society's demanding it, they have to think more broadly about the impact they have on society in terms of the environment, in terms of public health, kind of broader public well-being and so on. Marketers have a long history of focusing on what customers want. That's actually a premise of, the customer is always right and things like that we've all heard. The idea there that we talk about in this paper is that, customers tend to want things, really, when you look at how they spend their money, they want things that are quick and cheap and kind of get the job done and can get in their hands as quickly as possible and so on. Even though when asked, they might talk about a broader set of issues in terms of, recycled components and things like that. Long term, if we give people exactly what they want, quick, cheap, and so on, you could think of fast fashion companies that have built a whole business around this. It does create problems. It tends to create a lot of waste, landfill problems, and eventually people realize kind of the harm of some of the things they're doing. Even if you think about food products as innovations, a lot of fast food, the fastest food, very high in calories, high in fats and salts and lots of bad things. So we can't always listen to what the customer says they want because in the long run, they're probably going to realize that we were leading them astray as a marketer and there'll be a backlash because of that. And we want to keep them loyal long-term customers as much as we can. So the voice of the product is kind of a flip on a classic concept in marketing of the voice of the customer. So the voice of the customer is listening to the customer, understanding their needs, kind of the whole basic premise of how we think of marketing. And so in this paper, we talk about this new concept of voice of the product, which to some extent relates to ideas like cradle to cradle thinking about products, which means you worry about the materials that go into a product and not just what those materials are, but where they came from. Were they produced in a sustainable, socially responsible way? What kind of transportation was required? How much energy was consumed, and so on to get that product together? Looking at how people use the product, does it create waste along the way? Does it give off gases, depending on what the problem is? And then how do we deal with that product at the end of its life? How do we dispose of it responsibly so it doesn't end up in a landfill somewhere? And so the idea of voice of the product means we're always thinking about the product's life journey. So if we think about an automobile, for example, electric automobiles are kind of an interesting example of that, I think. At first glance, a lot of people think they're electric and they're not spitting out exhaust, and that's a good thing, and it is. And they think that they're sort of 100% environmentally clean and nice. But, in reality, that's not the case. Producing lithium batteries is a really ugly, messy process. Electric cars are heavier, and so they wear out their tires more quickly. And so you have the tire cycle is shorter on them, which has its own waste and negative effects. And so the idea of a voice of the product is trying to understand all of those things to give a full picture of the consequences of using a certain product and trying to minimize the bad, consequences and maximize the good for consumers. Say expectations to minimize packaging. That's a good example. So, if you want to minimize waste and stresses on the recycling system even and things like that, because recycling is not free in terms of, energy is required, you're moving materials around and so on. The idea there is to minimize packaging, to keep it simple, to use recycled materials and so on. Yet there's a whole new job description in many companies now, like Apple and others, of the customer opening experience manager. So, we've seen companies and products where opening the product is a really cool experience. You open something, you fold something back, there's another package inside of that, it's wrapped in something beautiful, you take it out, then there's another box you open. A lot of times that kind of desire for this sort of magical unfolding experience when introducing a new product or obtaining a new product runs contrary to being environmentally conscious and keeping it simple and plain and minimal wrapping and so on. And so that's kind of a struggle, I think, that companies have to think about. And so what we're trying to do is raise issues like that to get companies to think more about it. So can you create a great opening experience while still minimizing packaging and using the right kinds of materials and working a little harder at that. And companies can, and some do. And so that's the idea there we're trying to get across. I think companies are recognized, for doing the right thing when it comes to this. And in all of these issues, in terms of what we call better world marketing, there are companies, say like Patagonia and others, that are just known for really caring about these things in an authentic way. And more customers seem to care about that. And that's really what's going to pull that interest from companies. You can think about companies doing the right things based on the values of leadership or of what customers are demanding. At the end of the day, it's hard to have good sort of better world values as a leader if there isn't a demand out there. So sometimes there's a balancing there. But I think that doing well at these things is recognized by more and more people. More and more people care about the content, the materials that are in the things that they buy. Are they recycled materials? Are they healthy materials, and so on? So marketers that are thinking of purpose-driven innovation, I think the excuse that they would tend to use a lot of times is expense. That it's more expensive to use sort of more environmentally friendly materials in a product than to use whatever kind of horrible plastic that they might use instead, and things like that. And so when you have to make an argument that you need to do something that costs more to going to raise your product cost, that's a challenge. But I think what you can see more and more is the companies that do those things well, they're going to sell more volume, they're going to sell more product, and they can even probably charge a little more for it. And when companies do that, charging a premium for a better product for the world, that's really kind of a win-win. Greenwashing is the idea that companies talk a good game, but don't necessarily live up to it. And I won't mention some specifics, but there are some companies that everyone knows. I do think that there are more and more enlightened customers all the time that really do more homework when they make purchases. And they can pretty easily, with the information available online these days, dig through that and see which companies really are doing the right things and which ones are just kind of faking it.